So today we continue as we look and dig into failure, our topic. If you were worried, things get a little bit lighter now after David. I don't know, how many of you have ever failed to live up to your own expectations? You know, you set yourself a goal and then you fail and you feel terrible about failing because you expected yourself to do better, and it just kind of escalates. Having said, I mean, the easiest explanation I have for that is thinking about it in sports, trying something new in a sport. You may or may not know that I was a dancer as a child, as a teenager and all these things, and I was pretty okay at it, as in I didn't make my classmates look bad most of the time, but I loved it. I loved to dance. A friend of mine who was actually a good dancer described recently to me how about the first time she saw someone do a pirouette. Now, if you don't know the language of dance, a pirouette is a very specific kind of spin, and it looks very simple when you first see it. It is, I'm not going to demonstrate because I'm most likely going to fall over. I still know how to do it, but the balance thing is something that I lost as a teenager. But if you watch someone especially who knows what they're doing, it looks like nothing. They simply spin and stop. The stopping's the hard part, actually. But my friend, she described how when she was young and she was just starting to learn the harder bits of technique, and she saw older dancers do these beautiful and simple these spins. Her teacher started them slowly, and this is how you learn in dance. You start with very simple things. You start with quarter turns, so you're only turning to the side, and then to the side, and so you go around 4 times. You start with just your arms or just your legs, or you do things over and over and over again. But of course, she'd thought she'd perfected it, you know, after maybe a quarter turn and learning the hand movement, so she spun, of course. And this is what every dancer does when they first get the chance to figure out how to do this. You spin, and then you fall down. Every time. Every new dancer will fall down trying to do this. Or just stumble and fall again, or fall like 12 times. I don't remember learning how to do a pirouette, but I remember trying to learn how to do a backwards somersault for a dance routine one time, and I spent like all semester with my knees just like nasty shade of purple because I'd flip over and then I'd slam into the ground. This is what I did over and over because I thought, we all think it. I can do this. That looks easy. Everybody else makes it look easy. My friend, she figured out how to do a pirouette, but she fell over 20 times first. And these are the expectations we have on ourselves sometimes. We've been talking about failure the last few weeks, failure based on, you have the circumstances of Joseph. It wasn't really his fault, but he had to deal with it anyway. We have the failure of Jonah from turning away from God, and the failure of using God's gifts for evil like David. Today, our failure is another story. You know it well. Our video started to tell the story. And so this is from Matthew chapter 26. We're going to start with verses 31 through 35. This is during the Last Supper when Jesus is telling the story, and then later again. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Though all become deserters because of you, I will never desert you." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." So said all the disciples. And a bit later, from verses 69 through 75, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You were also with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you're talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Joseph of Nazareth," or Jesus of Nazareth. Again, he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know the man." And at that moment the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and he wept bitterly. So here we are with a really dejected and bitter Peter. Not really bitter, but lost. Peter is, of course, one of the most fleshed out people in the Bible. We see his successes and his failures. I see you laughing, so I got to figure it. Oh, that's pretty harsh. Ghosted. He tries so hard, time and again, to be perfect. That's kind of the main character trait of Peter. I'm going to be the best. I'm going to do it. I can do it. And then, Jesus, we were reading in youth group, Jesus is like, "Get behind me, Satan." Literally calls Peter Satan for one of the things he tells him earlier, or tries to do earlier in their relationship. He tries so hard every single time. And this is one of the reasons it makes Peter such a real person. Imperfect, impetuous. He always wants to be perfect, and yet he shows again and again in his response to Jesus. Like at this point in the disciples' relationship with Jesus, you would assume that they've figured out he's always right. Like they've been together for 3 years, and every time he says something, it happens, and every time he tells them to do something, they can do it, and all of these things. But Peter takes it as a challenge. The youth group thinks that when Jesus is telling the disciples things, sometimes he's trying to use reverse psychology, like, don't tell people about me, and then everybody goes off and tells everybody about Jesus. And this is how Peter takes it. Jesus is flat out like, "You're going to betray me." And Peter's like, "No, I'm not. I can do it. Thank you, Jesus. It's challenge accepted." "What do you mean I'm going to desert you? I'd never do that. I'm always there for you, Jesus." We do this to ourselves a lot. Promises, we make these kind of promises that set ourselves up for failure. We overestimate our own courage, our own strength, our own will. Like my friend assuming that pirouettes would be easy and as simple as they looked, Peter assumes that the future challenges that he has no idea about will be as easy as the one he's already faced. And the ones he's already faced, he's failed at a few times. So I'm not entirely sure where he gets his courage and his confidence, but he's got it. But we've got so many moments in our lives that this kind of failure affects it. Think about the ways that those times in our lives that when we've thought a little too highly of ourselves and our failure was that much worse for it. Not just confidence, not just solid confidence in who we are, but overconfidence in assuming that we are better than we ever have any right to assume. One aspect of the failure, like my friends, is based in achievement. If you think about failure in the sense of the things that you can achieve, like not getting into the colleges you expected, not getting the job you expected. I have interviewed people for jobs that don't even meet the basic requirements of the application, like, here's the application and here are the guidelines for the application, and you can't even read those instructions. But they believe so highly of themselves that they show up for the interview and they're like, "Oh, yeah, I didn't do that." This is where confidence and arrogance dance a really fine line. This is where it turns from confidence to arrogance. But we've all done it. Of course I'll make the team, get that grade, get the job. In areas of achievement and success, failure helps us to find new ways to learn and grow. All the experts on failure, every TED Talk on failure basically tells you, or every TED Talk that's supposedly about success is really about failure, because you have to fail so many times to succeed in business, in life, in these kind of things. And when it comes to achievement, if you're doing it right, failure's a good thing for you. Well, if I haven't failed that application, my life would have gone in a very different direction. If I'd never been challenged in that way, how would I have learned it? These are really simple parts of life. But another aspect of this kind of failure, and this is where Peter's failure comes in, because he's not, sometimes he's trying to achieve, best disciple, but in this moment, he's not really trying to outthink the other disciples. He's faced with a moral dilemma, being faced with finding out who we really are as people. In a few weeks, it's going to be Lent, the time that we prepare for Easter. And during our time of Lent this year, we're going to talk about virtues, those parts of ourselves that we kind of cultivate and we grow that help us to make moral decisions, those things that help us to when the moments are difficult. See, Peter had an image of himself. He was a good guy. He was a good friend. He was loyal to Jesus. He was the kind that was always by Jesus' side. And Peter was. Jesus took him everywhere. Even when Jesus decided only a small group needed to go with him, Peter was always one of them. Peter was used to being there. And this is what he told himself. So of course he declared, I'll never desert you. I'll not deny you. Jesus, why would you say that? I've got courage. I've got it in spades. And he does. He holds up pretty well. Because the night after this moment gets dark real quick. He doesn't fail when they show up to the garden when they're praying. Well, actually, they do. They all fail in the garden when they're falling asleep while Jesus is praying. I forgot about that. But when the soldiers show up, Peter is ready to defend him. In fact, in one of the stories, he attacks one of the soldiers, cuts off his ear, and Jesus has to heal somebody right away. Peter doesn't abandon him in the moment that's probably the scariest moment. He doesn't abandon him when he himself could be arrested. He doesn't abandon him when it's dangerous. And then he doesn't even after Jesus is taken away, he doesn't go and hide. He follows him to the trial. And Peter's standing outside Jesus' trial, and that's where, in the shadow and in the dark, that his failure begins. Not in the danger of the garden, but in the shadowed places with people who didn't have a lot of power. Servant girls and bystanders. Peter fails not just once, but 3 times. He hears the rooster crowing, and he falls into despair as his failure is complete. So as Peter's failures were connected to his own expectations, so are our own so often. Our own failures connected to what we expected of ourselves. So I want you to think about, during our discussion time today, these 2 questions. In what ways have you given yourself expectations that have led to failure? And also, why do you think this is the moment that Peter fails? Why do you think he failed in the dark shadows of Jesus' trial rather than the dangerous moments in the garden? So those are your 2 questions. I'll give you about 5 minutes. Talk amongst yourselves, and we'll gather together at the end. When we think about failures in our lives, the idea that we're failing as parents is a strong one, and it's one that gets us every single time. In multiple groups, we're talking about that a little bit, like the ways that I've failed to live up to my expectations. Okay, so I'm going to be the good mom that doesn't get upset, and then I'm screaming at my kids, or I'm going to be the one who can get, Lena down for her nap, and then I'm the one begging Kyle to come in and help because I can't do it. These are the realities of parenting. And what does failure in the midst of all of that mean? And I don't know. Those of you who have parented children that are a little older, help. You've raised into an adult. You could probably even help us out here. But when it comes to, these expectations, you just had fun with the denied sticker, didn't you? When it comes to these expectations we have for ourselves, there's those almost 2 distinct categories. You have the expectations of success, and you have the expectations, but then there's the moral expectations, and those times that it's a little bit easier to just say, oh, I don't know, or to just hide about it. I think one of the reasons that Peter fails in this moment is because there's not a lot of consequences. There's not an immediate consequence. It was easier for Peter to have courage when Jesus is standing right beside him and he knows that Jesus is watching than it is when, nobody's really paying attention. He doesn't matter. None of the video, the Jesus Christ Superstar, having Mary Magdalene come in and see Peter's failure is very different than the story of him figuring it out himself. But I think about the times in our lives that we've been talking about these times that we've kind of ignored the Holy Spirit that's been talking to us and trying to tell us to speak up, to step in, to do something, and then we ignore it, and then we feel guilty. And that it itches at us, it gets at us. I can still remember, I was talking to Jansen this week because I had called him out used his example a couple weeks ago, but I can still remember. I have no idea who it was about, what it was about, but I remember one time in high school sitting in the bleachers, and there was somebody sitting by themselves, and I kept feeling like I should go sit with them, and I never did. And I have no idea who it was. I have no idea what was happening. But I remember the failure more than anything else, and because it felt like a failure to God. And that's what Peter's dealing with, is this moment where it's not just his failure, it's a failure to God. It's a failure to a promise. And he's got to finally deal with the fact that he's not the greatest disciple ever. He's not perfect. And no matter how many times he had thought about that, about himself, he had to deal with it. And the good news about the good news, Jesus puns. Okay. The good news about it all is that, in this Bible facts, in this moment we have, it's the dark of the night, and it's Thursday night. It's the crucifixion is coming. It's dark. It's scary, and then the resurrection comes, and Jesus shows up again. And Peter, while he fails in this moment, he is there the rest of the time. He's there. He listens to Mary Magdalene when Mary says, something's wrong at the tomb. I've seen Jesus. This is happening. Peter goes running. And he finds the empty tomb. And he doesn't get to see Jesus right away, but he has these moments. And it all kind of culminates for Peter in one of my favorite scriptures in John 21, where Peter and the disciples, again, they've kind of stepped away for a time. They're fishing all night. And Peter's out on the boat, and he sees somebody on the beach, and he just knows it's Jesus. And so, being weird, and Peter, he puts his clothes back on, and then jumps into the water to swim, because there's weird Peter stuff. And he gets to the beach, and Jesus is like, all right, let's have breakfast. He starts frying up the fish, and he turns to Peter, and he says, do you love me? And Peter says, oh, well, of course I do. Of course I do. And Peter responds, feed my sheep. And then it's, again, do you love me? Feed my lambs. Do you love me? And, he says it 3 times, which is just as many times as he denies him. And so in that moment, and it's just so beautiful to me, because in that moment, Jesus is giving him a chance at forgiveness, a chance for confession. And he's giving him that kind of line for line forgiveness, and saying, you've got work to do. This isn't the end. Okay, you love me, prove it. Feed my sheep. You love me, but you denied me, so you have a whole lot more work to do. And so Peter takes and kind of grows up at that moment and really steps into that leadership that he wanted so much throughout the time as a disciple, and then suddenly he becomes the leader of the church. He's the rock he's the start of the church. And that's one of the beautiful things about failure when it comes. So failure when it comes to success, you have to learn from it, you have to grow from it, you have to do these things, you have to keep working and do all these things. Failure when it comes to God, you have to learn from it, you have to grow from it, you have to turn back to God and say, I messed up. Forgive me. And then step forward. Because God's always there asking, do you love me? We were joking in the back that I keep giving these hard questions, and so next week's questions are going to be, who loves you? Who loves you? Jesus. There we go. Sunday school answer. But really, here's my version of that question again. Do you love Jesus? Jesus is asking, do you love me? So that is the response to our failure. Every time you forget to stand up for God, every time you forget to speak God's name, every time you forget that it's important to care for others, and every time you let that anger out on someone else, including, maybe sometimes it is our kids, and our kids are going to forgive this anyway, but turn to God and say, I do love you, God. I will do this. I will figure it out.